in this discussion. We have a terrific panel to talk about some of these issues. To my immediate right here is Michelle Flournoy, who was the Undersecretary of Defense and is now at the Boston Consulting Group, doing some consulting and working with CNAS, a think tank here in town. David Sandalow, to her right, was Undersecretary of Energy, ran the international side at Energy for a long time. I believe he made 14 trips to China during the course of 3 years?
4 years.
4 years. Well, that's still pretty frequent. And Mark Lippert here is the Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Defense and was a longtime advisor to President Obama during the campaign, and then was at the White House for a while before serving a tour, I guess, in the Middle East. Is that correct?
Parts unknown.
Parts unknown. Yeah, parts unknown. Well, I hope they were known to you. In any event, so let's take these issues. We can take them in reverse order. The island dispute is on people's minds, and we've had a little bit of a discussion about the air defense zones. And here we have Danny Russell, who's the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific. And we're just starting, so you haven't missed a thing. But let me turn to you, Michelle. Is this just, big powers sort of, puffing up their chests a little bit, and this is really kind of political sideshow designed to distract people at home from other problems? Or is there a potential for a real serious security upheaval in the region associated with these island disputes?
My own view is that steps like the one that China's just taken in establishing this air defense zone, asserting a sovereign claim to an area in a way that really does not accord with international law or accepted international practice, it is certainly responding to nationalist pressures at home and so forth, but it has great potential to create the conditions for miscalculation. If you were to have, Chinese fighter jets regularly scrambling to either intercept civilian airliners or military aircraft passing through the zone, you're asking for some kind of miscalculation at some point of the sort that, frankly, we've seen this movie before with the P3 incident many years ago. And I think everyone agrees that that kind of incident would really set back the relationship we are trying to build with China and that others in the region are trying to build. So I think we should use this as an opportunity to press all of the parties to enhance their communications, to start to try to talk and negotiate about the issues, and also to invest in some crisis management communications and tools, so that if there is some kind of potential for miscalculation, we have ways of de-escalating, and that's something that I don't see as being adequately in place.
So earlier in the discussion today, there's a bit of a sense that the United States has been sending mixed signals on this. So we spoke out against it, but when we did the B-52 overflight, we then announced that the B-52s weren't armed. The vice president went over to speak to the Chinese about this and ultimately issued a message which didn't appear to challenge the Chinese as strongly as some people thought they may. Now, that could be canny balancing of diplomatic messages publicly and different messages privately. But it was a concern in the crowd. And so, Danny, maybe you could address that for a second.
Well, thanks, David. I was actually with the Vice President when he addressed the air defense identification zone issue, first in Tokyo, then in China, as well as in Korea. I think we've been very clear, not only about the ADIZ, but about the broader issues that Michelle just alluded to. Let's break it apart. There are a couple of issues. There are the big and underlying issues of sovereignty, both in the East China Sea and in the South China Sea. Those aren't issues where we are attempting to adjudicate it. What we're focused on is the second set of issues, which is really about And this ties to the question of what kind of rising power is China going to be, and will China's rise net contribute to the stability and the prosperity of the region. So the consistent messages from the United States, dating back to 2010 in connection with the South China Sea, relevant to the East China Sea, but also applicable in the ADIZ, is that the actions of the players have to comport to two basic principles. One, that without the use of coercion, actions need to be consistent with norms and international law. Secondly, to Michelle's point, that it's very important to have mechanisms for communication to prevent crises, to prevent incidents, or to manage incidents when they occur and stop them from escalating. So the points that the Vice President, as well as the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State have made aren't challenging this as an abstract question, does China have the right to create an ADIZ? Instead, we've gone to the bigger question, what does this behavior mean, and what's the impact that it has on the region, on regional stability? In the case of the ADIZ, it's a very negative impact, and it's raised serious concerns. It introduces the risk of confusion, accident, or an incident in the airspace. And most particularly, it represents an extension into an area that is fraught with tension already, that includes territory that's administered by others. So the Vice President, rather than going after the theoretical issue of China's right, or calling on China to reverse itself, something that is not enough power, it's China's power, focused instead on the key facts. We don't recognize it. We will not be limited by it. The flight through the region of B-2, as well as other aircraft, is evidence of that. And in as much as we and the Japanese and the Koreans don't recognize it, it's incumbent on the Chinese not to follow through on the implementation that they've alluded to that could create a crisis, and certainly not to replicate this kind of behavior in other contested areas.
Okay, so I want to continue through with a couple more questions in China, then we'll go to North Korea, then we'll do another Asia question or two, and then we're going to open it up to the audience and get their perspectives. But Mark, Michelle made the point that one of the problems with this kind of thing is that it could lead to miscalculation. But in retrospect, it has been wondered aloud here earlier in the day that perhaps the Chinese miscalculated in this instance, that they didn't recognize what international reaction would be. I wonder if that comes from the fact that China is beginning to change its military posture, to look out more, to look at projecting force in the region more. We talked earlier in the day about potential restructuring within the Chinese military, moving away from a domestic regional focus to more of an international focus, their own pivot, if you will, and that they're just not very experienced at this. And now we've had the EP3 incident, we've had some others. The question is, are we sort of at the beginning of a new era in which China's learning how to be a regional power in a new way? Do you think?
Let me answer the question this way. I think what you're seeing is increased defense spending commensurate with the rise of power. And as a result, I think you are seeing more activity from the Chinese. What their ultimate intentions are, I think, is another great debate and discussion among both academics and in the interagency. I do think that we recognize some of the both promise and peril of the situation. And it's precisely why the President and the Secretary of Defense have put such a premium on the mill-to-mill relationship. We view what we think is, at this point, not a mature relationship yet, mill-to-mill, as something we need to invest more in. The PLA is a very important institution, both domestically and internationally, and it's an area in which the Defense Department recognizes that relationship is going to be key for the next several decades. And so, accordingly, we've taken a number of steps, that people may or may not be aware of. One, in an unprecedented fashion, Secretary Panetta, when he was traveling to China, invited the Chinese to participate in the Ring Pacific exercise. And a couple of years ago, the Chinese were out, in a submarine spying, and now they're in the exercise, fully integrated, working with partners, allies, and friends in the region, learning various international norms and ways militaries behave. The other piece of this is obviously we're really stepping up our visits to China, our exchanges with China, trying to basically deepen and broaden that relationship and touch different pieces of the PLA that hitherto had not been touched. And then I think finally it's, the dialogues are very important that we have with them. We do have a, sort of a mechanism that we talk to them about international rules of the road, a sort of mid-level DoD to PLA platform. That's actually borne slow but important fruit. And I think we are going to try to place a little more emphasis on the coming days. And I think that all, is led by the overall perspective by Secretary Hagel, the President, and others, that, look, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that leaders make strategic choices, not mid-level officers that where there are accidents or miscalculations that back leaders into bad strategic choices.
Although, one of the things that struck me in terms of the discussion of the pivot or the strategic rebalancing, or however we wish to characterize it, that was underappreciated was the creation of mid-level dialogues. When you had bilateral talks, they were often at a high level. Now you're bringing in people at the Deputy Assistant Secretary level. You're bringing people, and that establishing those kind of conduits for information is also a controlling factor. So you're not saying that's not significant. You're saying alongside the mill-to-mill, alongside the high level, alongside that.
Yeah, no, David, what I'm saying is that absolutely, but what I'm saying is in an operational sense, when you have ships in close proximity, mid-level officers running these ships as militaries do, what you don't want is accidents at sea or miscalculations by mid-level officers to back leaders in the strategic choices. And it's a message the President has said often to the Chinese that, hey, look, we're leaders of countries. We need to make strategic choices, but what we can't have are accidents and miscalculations driving strategic choices and the overall direction of our bilateral relationship. So to answer your question directly, yes, the proliferation of more dialogues, more exchanges by officers is incredibly helpful. Deputy Assistant Secretary level, country director level. I think it's been one of the real benefits of the rebalance. But what I'm saying is all of this has the ability to kind of, make sure that the operational issues out in the maritime and air environments don't inadvertently trigger decision-making at a national level.
And one footnote that was interesting for me to witness was, as we've improved this operational dialogue, it's actually had an impact on the fidelity of information reporting up and down the Chinese chain of command. I think in the past they didn't always have a clear picture of how their own forces were necessarily interpreting things on the ground. When we're able to reflect back to them, well, we were concerned when we saw this or we did that. Sometimes that's new information to some of the higher levels of leadership. So I think that it's also helped to foster a little bit more clarity of communication and oversight on the Chinese side.
Could I add a second footnote?
Okay, so add a second footnote, then I'll go to David.
Also an extraordinary progression in our interaction with the Chinese at senior and mid levels that combines the military and the civilian authorities, as Michelle personally can attest because she was part of the origin of what we call the strategic security dialogue that combines the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff, State Department at the Deputy Secretary level. And we have integrated in this bilateral dialogue the Chinese PLA with the MFA and other agencies. In some respects, perhaps uniquely in that it's an unusual phenomenon for the Chinese military and civilians to not only sit together, but to sit across the table from Americans. And this has led to a kind of cross dialogue that we think contributes significantly to stability.
Okay, David, I wanted to turn to you with a question that sort of linked the security with the energy. But did you want to say something about that?
Thanks, David. I was in Beijing last week, and conversations then underscored the importance of the points that Michelle and Danny and Mark are making about the mechanisms for controlling what's better to it. What I heard was placing this issue in a historical frame for the Chinese, that they think about this in a multi-century time frame, that they see their borders as having been shrunk over the course of colonial rule, and that they are now reclaiming, not just here but elsewhere, appropriate boundaries for the country. So I think that suggests that however this particular issue is managed, it won't be the last.
Although I do, just as a footnote, I think Michelle's point has a lot of other resonances in the sense that you talk about fidelity of information up and down the chain. The Chinese system, whether it's economic reporting of companies up the chain or whether it's reporting of localities to Beijing, has had some very dubious flows of information. But as they engage with the rest of the world and the flows out and in become better than the flows up and down the chain, it changes the dynamic internally. So that you enter an age of more transparency, and it actually has an effect in terms of things like corruption and other ways. Anyway, part of the Chinese pivot outward has to do with the fact that they're dependent on energy from every place else, and that the people who protect the flow of energy to China are us. And I don't think this is a situation that's ever existed in the history of the world where the biggest rival was the critical defender of the vital resource to the other rival. And clearly the Chinese don't want that to be the case forever. And one thing they're doing about it is building up their blue water navy and building up their capability to go out and defend themselves. But the other thing they're trying to do is what they call energy underfoot. They seem to be spending more money on developing internal and alternative energy resources than every other country in the world added up. You're kind of the leading expert on that. I'm just.
No, you're exactly right, David. In 2005, China was not a net importer of natural gas. They're now moving towards being a massive net importer of natural gas. And of course, we've switched, right? And so we're now moving into a world in which we're exporting natural gas. The Chinese are going to be they're already the largest importers of oil in the world, new development, and are moving towards some 80 or 90% dependence on oil, on imported oil. And probably the question I get most going to China these days is, what will be the strategic impact of the United States moving towards near self-sufficiency in oil and gas? Will you continue to protect the oil lanes? President Obama actually spoke to this in I think comments that got relatively little notice on the floor of the UN in his Middle East speech last September, in which he identified 4 core interests for the United States. The first he identified was protecting the free flow of oil out of the region. And he wrapped that in the context. Are you getting? He wrapped that in the context of the move toward additional energy production in the United States. So I think the president, and actually Tom Donilon gave a speech in which he said the same thing. But there's a lot of skepticism in Asia right now about whether the United States will really be protecting the free flow of energy out of the Middle East in a world in which we're producing so much on our own.
It's an interesting point, and I want to come back to sort of U.S. position in Asia in a second with a question for Danny. But Michelle, another of the questions we talked about up there had to do with North Korea. Clearly, that's been a very precarious situation for a long time. But it looks like things are changing there a little more rapidly and a little more differently than we had expected. This group here looked at the shift with moving out Kim Jong-un's uncle as being a kind of a sign of weakness. And do you think the situation there is growing more precarious and more worrisome?
I would say there are at least 3 things that have me more worried than normal. I've always been worried about North Korea, but even more so. First is, I think this new leader is even more unpredictable and difficult to really understand his
And you're not just talking
calculus.
about his friendship with Dennis Rodman.
Not just his friendship with Dennis Rodman, but he is even less predictable than his father or his grandfather, I would argue. And so really understanding what is going on, and I think he had far less preparation for the job. He was much less equipped for the job upon assuming power and so forth. So that's the first thing. Second is simply the march of technology. We see continued progress in both the North Korean long-range missile program and in their march towards being able to miniaturize nuclear weapons and put them on top of longer-range missiles. And that, changes the threat to our close allies in the region. It changes ultimately over the mid to longer term the threat to us. And then the third piece is, it seems that North Korea cares less about what China's view of their behavior is. We have always been able, at least not always, in the recent past, we have been able to work quite well with China and with our allies in the region to apply some effective pressure on North Korea when it's become too provocative. This leader seems to be less affected by pressure from Beijing. That's my perception.
Mark, do you want to give a view on that particular stuff?
I think what I would say is this, we at DoD have always viewed the situation as very, I would say very, it's a very dangerous and situation going back for a couple of years now. So I think that, look, we watch these activities closely, but we've been in sort of a heightened state of readiness on the peninsula for some time. And, I just point to a couple of things. One, we made the decision to move the ground-based interceptors, a while back. Two, I think we're upgrading and modernizing the alliances in both South Korea and Japan. Putting our best platforms and weapon systems into those countries. Three, I think on the diplomatic side, just in terms of alliance management and something we work on at DoD, is the alliances in both Korea and Japan have rarely been stronger in history in terms of popularity and public support. And then finally, as a core part of the rebalance, we do work on the security side very, very hard on trilateral cooperation between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. Even in the middle of some tensions between Tokyo and Seoul, the security side has continued on pretty effectively. We think that security side does send a pretty clear message to the region about the commitment, about the capacity, and about the vigilance we describe this problem.
Okay, Dan, I'd like to turn, I don't want to dwell, too much in any one country, because this group, I know, will pose questions that will bring us back to some of them. I've traveled in the region a little bit in the past couple of months, in Australia, talked to some leaders in Japan, Korea, was in Singapore, talked to some Indians. I'll be candid with you. The response, or the main question I got was, what happened to the pivot? What happened to American leadership in this region? We thought something was happening. The president said something was happening. Secretary Clinton said something was happening. We've always seen a lot of activity from PACOM and DoD. They've always sort of been the avatar of this kind of thing. And then it seemed to stop. And Secretary Kerry seems to be interested in the Middle East, and the president has been bogged down at home, and yes, Vice President Biden has come over, but we're just not getting the attention that we got. And by the way, you guys need to be careful, because China does have a vision for its role in this region. It's going around country to country in Southeast Asia saying, you want a port, we'll build you a port. You want a highway, we'll build you a highway. We want to build interdependence in this region. We have a vision for an architecture of this region, and all these countries want America there. They want a counterbalance, and they're fearing that because we're dysfunctional at home and that keeps people from making trips, and because we're distracted by crises elsewhere that won't seem to go away, that we're just not going to be able to devote enough attention to it. So I wonder if you could address that.
Sure. Well, thanks, Dave. Look, there's perennial hand-wringing about American interest, about American commitment, and about American sustainability. But the fact is, there's also universal recognition that U.S. relations with countries in the region, first and foremost with our security partners and allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, but also Philippines, Thailand, important security partners like Singapore, are literally better today than they have ever been in history, and certainly better than they were 5 years ago. We're on very solid ground with respect to our bilateral relationships. Secondly, there is an unprecedented level of U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia with ASEAN as an organization and with the individual ASEAN countries. And it ranges from intensified cooperation across the spectrum of security and economic and people-to-people relations with old friends like Singapore, but also the phenomenal transformation in Burma, Myanmar, which we certainly actively supported and continue to support, represents has enabled a qualitative change in our relationships and our engagement. The president has met annually with the 10 ASEAN leaders. There's no precedent for that. Since signing the TAC and joining the East Asia Summit, the president has been attending regularly. This year, as you alluded to, because of unrelated domestic issues at home, Secretary Kerry took his place. Every leader that I was with him, every leader that spoke to him said, I get what President Obama had to do. We have politics too. I don't think this was
So you don't sense this question that I sensed. You don't sense that there is some concern about America's involvement, a level of engagement.
The countries in the region will continue to look for evidence and proof points that the U.S. is serious, is committed, is involved, and that our staying power is something that they can trust in. So that desire and that demand signal will never be saturated, will never be sated. But even Secretary Kerry, despite the tremendous effort and energy that he has put into the Middle East, has already been to Asia for serious, sustained visits 3 times, and I can attest to this personally because we're leaving in a few hours, is going back for a 4th time. That's pretty considerable. Secretary Kerry was received with open arms by all the leaders in Bali and in Brunei who had planned to hold bilateral meetings with President Obama. Nobody pulled it down. Here in Washington, he has met with a number of foreign ministers. In New York in September, he hosted a meeting of the 10 ASEAN foreign ministers. Secretary Hagel, Secretary Liu, Secretary Pritzker, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The roster of high-level engagement by U.S. officials in the region, as well as the level of the extraordinary access that President Obama has granted to foreign leaders. He had the Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Hsien. He had Xi Jinping for a day and a half in sunny lands in California. Thein Sein, numerous leaders have been welcomed in the White House in 2013. There's a very robust level of engagement that comes above and beyond the extensive investment that we're making in diplomatic presence, in development activities, in people-to-people exchanges, with a particular focus on education, but maybe arguably most importantly on the economic side, where in addition to TPP, which involves Pacific Rim countries and is set to start a race to the top for a very high level and comprehensive trade relationship. We also have programs for enhancing our economic engagement with the non-TPP countries in Asia. And Secretary Pritzker has already begun a pretty ambitious program of outreach that marries what the U.S. government can do with what the private sector is doing. And David certainly can speak to the work that we have been doing on the
Well,
energy
I won't
side.
get to the energy. Did you want to say
No,
something?
I just wanted to add, I just came back from the region a couple of weeks ago as well, and my sense is the thing that has most disturbed our close friends and partners was watching the depths of our political paralysis here at home, and their concern that, is this a time when America's going to turn inward? Is this a time where we will be so consumed by our inability to get a budget deal and move forward and function as a government that, our reliability will be in question? I actually think that getting some modest budget deal, even if it's only short term, returning to sort of normal order, passing budgets, having a functioning Congress, bringing the TPP negotiations to fruition, having the Secretary of State show up and lead at all the right meetings, have the U.S. military rebalance continued as planned now that we're out from under sequestration and cuts to readiness. I think there will be a calming down of some of this, because I think it has less to do with the eaches of any real change in administration policy, which I don't think there has been, and more just being deeply disturbed by our internal paralysis and the sort of perception of turning inward. So to the extent we can actually move beyond this period of crisis and paralysis, I think the region will, exhale a sigh of relief.
Also, David, it's nice to be wanted, just to take the 100,000-foot level view. I mean, it's better that countries want us there more than want us there less, and that's not something that in the big scheme we should take for granted.
Yeah, that's true. But look, I hear everything that you're saying, but I also heard the comments, and the comments were not, that yes, they want it, and yes, there's been a lot of activity. The question was, were there meaningful new things on the table? Were we expanding or were we contracting? Political paralysis at home was a big thing. Change in budget crisis and the impact of budget crisis and reducing our military presence in the region.
Enough.
Well, I understand. I'm just telling you what the concern was. But do you want to address that?
No, I think, we're not, and Mark can speak to this too, we're not, talking about some major military buildup by the United States in the region. What we're talking about is a relative shift of emphasis and activity coupled with protected, discrete investments in specific capabilities that will ensure our ability to project power, protect allies, deter aggression, maintain freedom of action in the region in the future. This is something that is affordable even as there are budget constraints in the Pentagon.
Okay, look, do you want to
Can I just make one comment, David? I think Michelle got it exactly right. I would just make a point in terms of, first of all, Secretary Hagel's been out there 3 times in the last 6 months, including 4 days in Korea, long stop in Japan, so on and so forth. The other things I would say also is, look, we're prioritizing the investment the Pentagon makes towards platforms with the most capabilities in the Pacific, and then and PACOM is getting priority of the platforms as they come off the line. Virginia-class attack submarines, F-22s, I could sort of go down the list. But I think the broader point is that in addition to doing what I would sort of call the blocking and tackling, we're also doing new and different things in DoD that we haven't seen in a while. For example, today, Secretary Hagel had lunch with all the ASEAN ambassadors, and that was a preview to an unprecedented summit ministerial that the Secretary will host in Hawaii in the spring with all of the ASEAN ambassadors. We're modernizing our posture in the Philippines, Singapore, Australia, Japan, and Korea in ways that we haven't seen before, getting it out of a Cold War architecture and much more a flexible, adaptable posture built for this century. And then finally, breakthroughs with countries, that we've had interesting relationships over the last several decades. New Zealand, coming in and really modernizing the defense relationship, and a Kiwi vessel will pull into Hawaii and participate in RIMPAC as full partners for the first time in 25 years. We updated with our key ally our joint vision statement with Thailand, which just as a year ago, its two principal goals were promoting Thai independence and fighting communism. And finally, with India, we're starting a new innovative defense trade relationship. So it's not just that we're doing more, we're protecting our investments in the Pacific, but we're doing different and innovative things at the defense.
And the India defense trade relationship is just in defense products, weapon systems, aircraft, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so what we're trying to do, and it's something that Ash Carter led personally, and we're gonna have to pick it up. I'm actually meeting with the Indians tomorrow on this. And Ash did just a tremendous job in moving the ball forward, but what we're trying to do with the Indians is get out of the classic buyer-seller relationship and into a co-production, cooperative relationship where there's real technology sharing and real innovation on both sides, and basically a concept that will help bind the two defense departments and militaries closer together over a long time.
Okay, we're going to take questions in a minute. In just a minute, Pete, not right now. I'm going to ask one more question on the soft power side, because on the soft power side, we have some tools, and we've talked about some of them. Engagement is one of them, and as our economy grows over the course of the next couple of years, and we become more desirable market trade, and TPP feeds that, and investment flows feed it. But David, one of the other areas, of course, is energy. Because as we move into being an exporter, that can have a strategic impact in the region. And as the shale boom took place, there became this sort of, I think, regular march, perhaps to your door within DOE, of Asian investors saying, well, when will you be exporting to us? Because the price of natural gas here is so much lower than it is in Japan and elsewhere. What kind of leverage do you think that gives us? And do you think we're going to actually take advantage of this, or are we going to sort of succumb to other kinds of pressures and look inward on this?
Well, a couple points. First, the United States government has now granted permits for the export of natural gas for well more than a dozen facilities. Facilities that can export to any country that we have a free trade agreement with. And then in 4 cases just this year for any country in the world. And so the permit is granted for a facility to export liquid natural gas, which is now cheap in the United States, and any commercial arrangement can come in, any commercial company can come in and make an arrangement with those terminals. So we are in the process of making it possible to export natural gas. The economics of that are interesting. Right now in the United States, natural gas is about $4 a million BTU. Most experts say that it costs probably between $5 and $7 a million BTU to liquefy it, put it on a ship, and get it over to Asia. The Asian price today is between 14 and 16. So it works on today's prices, and there's a lot of interest in that. But I want to make a comment about your point on soft power, because I think soft power is broader than simply shipping goods. And when I'm in Asia, one of the things I often hear about U.S. soft power particularly focuses on our university system and upon the innovative engine of the U.S. economy. And that, as much as anything, is what I find interest in. And it is just remarkable how the United States universities are the ones that are driving the world in energy innovation today, and the interest in exchanges with their universities, exchanges with the DOE national labs and others is so strong in Asia today because of that soft power that we've got.
Okay. There was a question here from Chris. So Keith, please stand right there.
Thanks very much. Chris Graves with Ogilvy. We have thousands of employees in mainland China, and while China may be 5,000 years old, in Freudian terms, it feels like an arrogant, cocky teenager right now. And there's nothing greater when I talk to our young people there.
Do you think of China in Freudian terms?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Just as you do. But when we talk to our young staff, there's nothing better than to be young and Chinese right now. They're at the center of the universe, and it's all go. But to what degree do you think this is a bit of a risk and a bit of a danger of a rise of palpable nationalism in China? And to what degree the leadership has to play to this rise of nationalism, whether it be an air defense identification zone or anything else they may choose to do.
Go,
Yeah,
start
let
with
me
you.
start. And I tend to look at China in Jungian terms, not in
Interesting.
Freudian terms. But
Very, very interesting. I didn't expect this psychological twist to this discussion.
This goes to the question of not whether we accept China's rise, but will China rise in a way that is consistent with stability and prosperity in the region? What kind of a power will China be, and is China becoming? How we engage with China, the president believes, will be a factor in that equation. And for that reason, the administration set out and has sustained a commitment to, in the first instance, high-level engagement, in addition to the broader mechanisms of government to government, people to people, institution to institution engagement. And that high-level engagement, because after all, notwithstanding the active life of the youth in China, it is a one-party Leninist system. Being able to speak to and get at the policymakers, the decision makers directly, has proven to be tremendously important, and that direct conversation, such as Vice President Biden had 4 days ago, where he spent over 5 hours in dialogue with Xi Jinping, something that was possible in part because the U.S. President Obama had, as early as 2011, made the decision that we needed to engage further. That matters. Secondly, we are looking for ways to engineer practical cooperation with China on issues that genuinely matter. And thirdly, we've tried to find ways to engage directly and candidly with China on areas of disagreement and find ways to manage challenges. And the reason that that's important is because what we are doing is an attempt to give China a seat at the table, give China a voice in the region and the world and its own destiny, the voice that the Chinese feel they were robbed of in the 19th and the 20th century. But in exchange, to ask for a level of responsibility and an acceptance of the basic principle that rules are binding not only on the small and the weak, but on the big and the strong as well. And the genesis, therefore, of this concept of a new model, which, like all slogans, means something different to everybody, is precisely the conviction that there is no inevitable drive to strategic rivalry, that China's desire to be taken seriously and shown respect, to not to cast China as an adolescent or as Rodney Dangerfield, but to be taken seriously and given the respect that is warranted, isn't something that it needs to resort to ultranationalism or coercion to get. It's something that the world is fully prepared to afford it. The United States is prepared to afford it, but it's part of a broader, integrated system with equilibrium that you get from having rules that all consider themselves bound.
Would anybody else like to offer a different psychological perspective?
Well, I hear more about materialism than nationalism. I mean, there's this woman who became famous on a dating program in China by saying she'd rather cry in the back seat of a Mercedes than laugh on the back of a bicycle. And that seemed, people said, captured the mood. I don't know. The other comment I've heard is that China today has the biggest generation gap of any country in the world, that the young people in China today are leading such profoundly different lives than their parents, their grandparents, some of whom went through the Cultural Revolution, that in addition to all the other demographic challenges in China today, that's a big one.
Another question? Yes, right up here.
Caroline Bucky, global thinker, I guess.
No, you're a global thinker. You're
Okay.
a red ribbon.
Yes.
So you're definitely one.
So I was wondering if you could comment on the rapid rise of Chinese interest in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly around the extraction of natural resources, and what you see the role of the US administration, if any, on encouraging social responsibility and human rights in the region.
David?
I think this is a really interesting, important area. And actually, one way to think about this too is in sub-Saharan Africa is not just around extraction of resources, but also around energy access issues. And sub-Saharan Africa today has lots of people who don't have access to basic energy resources. Both the United States and China have interests in the continent. Xi Jinping put out the idea of a new model of a great power relationship. I wonder if there are ways that we can work together in the continent as opposed to competitively. You know, when Secretary Moniz, Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz, went to China, and I would add him to the list of cabinet secretaries who prioritized Asia, went to Asia in one of his first months in office. But when he went to China, one of the things that he did was publicly talk about how the US and China were going to work together on a tender for a nuclear power plant in England. And US companies and Chinese companies would work together. As we think about a new model of a great power relationship, I wonder if there are things that China and the United States can do externally together. And this could be an area. Obviously, in terms of the particular issue that you talk about, which is human rights and labor standards, there have been different approaches between our countries. Maybe it's something we can deepen the dialogue.
Do you guys want to talk about the rivalry dimension of it? Africa is a region that's roiling. We have some interest there. We're also concerned about some developments there. They are now getting more and more involved. Do you see that as a point of potential contention?
Well, look, there's a good example in the case of Sudan, where the U.S. and China each concluded that we have a common interest, not only derivative of energy resources, but a broader interest in addressing civil conflict. And we work together in the field and in capitals. We work together in New York at the UN Security Council. And I think that is a good model. I think that's the right model. We shouldn't accept, and we don't accept, the premise that engagement in Africa or in any country, in any continent, with China is a zero-sum proposition. We do have issues with behavior, not the principle. And the behavioral problems have to do with abetting corruption, with forms of extraction that are more 19th century than our 21st century. But it is also the case that you are seeing increasingly indigenous resistance to an approach from China that pays short shrift to the interests of the people and the long-term disposition of natural resources.
I mean, I might just make one small point as sort of an example on the Defense Department side in terms of an interesting new model type of activity was our cooperation and work with the Chinese on counter-piracy off the coast of Africa. And it's been actually a real success story, both in terms of tackling the problem, but also it's been one of the limited areas in which we've done a lot of bilateral work with the Chinese in terms of exercises and real-time communication in this area. And we've actually are trying to replicate that into other types of contacts with the Chinese in East Asia as well.
Other question? Let's go in the middle, and then we'll go over to Noah.
I'm Kei Nakaza from JICA. My question is to Mr. Russell. President Obama recently announced he's going to make a next national security strategy in early next year. And Japanese government is now making its first national security strategy. And I wonder, what is the thoughts about the role of foreign assistance to be played in national security strategy or national security of, for both countries?
Well, both Japan and the United States have something to offer, have a lot to offer, and both Japan and the United States have a huge vested interest in expanding the circle of prosperity. Development and development programs have proven central to not only the national security strategy as an abstraction, but literally to our national security. And particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, we see abundant examples which development support, development assistance facilitates not only the health and welfare of people, but the good governance and the provision of services that are directly connected to regional stability. We have huge interest in assisting the Pacific Island nations, for example, in developing the wherewithal to deal with the growing challenges of climate change. Japan, as well as the United States, is actively involved in development assistance in Burma, Myanmar, which has proven to be the essential ingredient to fostering and strengthening the democratic and the social, as well as the economic reform programs that are underway and in whose success we all have such a great stake. Maybe the best example, and Secretary Kerry will be visiting Vietnam and the Mekong region in just a few days, is a joint project called the Lower Mekong Initiative, which brings together the 5 countries that are downstream in the Mekong and share resources, and in which Japan is a cooperating partnership. So there are abundant examples, but the simple answer is development is a key element of national security, both as a principle and as a practical matter.
Hello? Noah Shackman with FP. This is a question for Danny and Mark. At the first part of the year, we heard a lot from the Obama administration about China's online espionage activities. There's a lot of public protestations about that. And since the NSA leaks have started, publicly at least, those protestations have gone kind of quiet. Are you still bringing these items up with the Chinese? And how have their responses changed since the NSA leaks, if at all?
Right. We raised this publicly in a very direct, very significant way early in the year, in part because we had concluded that our diplomatic and private messages were not getting through or not having the desired effect on the Chinese leadership. But remember what it was that we addressed. The issue of concern that we have flagged directly to the Chinese and publicly is the use of cyber-enabled theft of U.S. companies' economic, proprietary information and technology to be turned over to Chinese companies to gain economic advantage, competitive advantage. This is an IPR issue we have raised. This is different than the spy versus spy question of whether governments eavesdrop on each other, whether governments use cyber. This is unrelated to, different than the issues surrounding cyber warfare. What has changed is that the Chinese heard us and have started, at Secretary Kerry's initiative, a cyber working group that meets on a regular basis. In fact, there was just a major meeting of the group on December the 3rd in Beijing that works through.
Why was it major? I mean, what was there an outcome, or what was the subject?
Well, it's an ongoing process, but this was the most senior cyber
because
officials
it says highest level.
That are engaging across the spectrum of cyber-related issues. The issues surrounding the NSA disclosures, Snowden, while they create a tremendous amount of static, are not directly germane to the concerns that we discussed with the Chinese, and as best I can tell, are not having a meaningful impact on our ability to continue this effort.
Okay, I would just add one thing. Danny pretty much made all the points. I happened to speak with Eric Rosenbach, our Deputy Assistant Secretary in charge of cybersecurity before this event, and he had been part of the working group meeting in Beijing. And I think, look, the readout is, we've made some decent progress, but there's a lot more work to be done. But the fact is now we do seem to have a framework. There does seem to be regular contact, and there does seem to be some, incremental progress towards, one, mutual understanding, and two, actually dealing with the problem.
Other questions in the back there?
I'm Jagjit Sareen from Asian Development Bank North America office. My question to David and Danny would be if you could shed some light on US-China collaboration on climate change and how it leads to the global agreement in 2015. Thank you.
It's been a big area of...
I just want to give everybody a heads up. We've got about 7-8 minutes to go.
Okay. This has been an area of significant priority for the U.S. government, actually, from the time President Obama came into office. And among the things that were done is in the past 4 years, U.S. and China created a Clean Energy Research Center, which is the first time that had been done, which now has 1,000 different researchers working on issues like vehicles, coal, and buildings to try to develop the new clean energy technologies that are going to make a difference for the world. And that's just, I guess, it's a 7-part program that President Obama announced when he was in Beijing for his first visit. And Secretary Clinton certainly made these issues a priority. Secretary Kerry has made these issues an enormous priority. No senator, no member of Congress, I think, had given the climate change issue more attention than Secretary Kerry. He's carried that priority into his work as Secretary of State, and it's bringing that to embassies around the world. How it plays out in the context of the 2015 negotiations will remain to be seen. Those UN negotiations move slowly. They make the U.S. sound like a speed demon, but they're one important forum for advancing the climate change issues. As I've worked on climate change a number of years, my own view is the climate change issue is too important to just be left to that one forum, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. It needs to be taken up in a variety of other forums, and that's one thing that the U.S. and China have been making that a priority. Before it concluded, HFC control has been one area of particular importance. HFCs are super pollutants with dramatic global warming effects. The U.S. and China have been working bilaterally on this for the past year, and Todd Stern, our special envoy, has made this a particular priority.
Another question? Yes, there's
Hi, I'm Sabah Ismail from Pakistan. I'm one of the global thinker. My question is to Mark. Well, as we know that there is a continuous tension between US and Pakistan relationship, and China is investing a lot in the economy of Pakistan and energy. And I also heard, well, I was not able to verify, but China is also helping to train the militants from Pakistan. So how do you see the effect of involvement of China regarding to the US, Pakistan, and Afghanistan relationship?
Let me just say this. Secretary Hagel was in Pakistan just a few days ago as part of a 5-country trip, which we just got back last night, which probably explains my sluggish behavior here. But
You look great.
And look, he met with the Prime Minister, met with the new Army Chief of Staff, and I would just say a couple of things. One, the tone of the bilateral relationship is much improved. You could tell that both sides, while thorny issues remain, I think the atmospherics on both sides are much improved. Second, I think both sides did have a good, frank exchange on a range of issues, from counterterrorism to Afghanistan to the crown lines of communication to the neighborhood and the region. And so, I think that talking and engagement, about these issues in a pretty constructive and amicable way is a real step forward. In terms of the Chinese dimension on all of this, the issue while we were there really didn't come up. Obviously Pakistan is aware and constantly working through regional issues. But in terms of having a real Beijing having a real direct impact on the issues that we discussed and are dealing with at the Defense Department every day, it just did not seem to be very significant.
Okay, we'll have one more question, brief question, brief response.
My name is Ruben Useche. I live in Quito, Ecuador, and I am from Colombia. The question is very quick. I want to know the perspective that you have about the Pacific Alliance that joined all the group from Chile to Mexico, excluding some countries from Central America, but I know that Panama and Costa Rica is getting part of this bloc, regional bloc that some analysts call the new Brazil. And I want to know the perspective from the US for this Pacific Alliance.
Well, the simple and the short answer is that the U.S. is a Pacific power, not an Asian power, and our rebalancing strategy is rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific, not to Asia, not just to Asia. And whether the issue is APEC, whether the issue is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we think that it's hugely important to integrate all the countries of the Pacific Rim, and in that context, the Pacific Partnership has an important role to play.
Anyone want to add it? I know that the U.S. is an observer of the Pacific Partnership, I think, at this point. And one of the reasons that there's been so much support for it has been that it's originated within the countries of the region and sort of grown up and has the benefit